Heidegger, Hitler, and the return to poetry today. Heidegger, the German philosopher, is known to have bowed before the advent of the Nazi movement. He wasn't enthusiastic about it at all, but he caved in. And when the time came to say no in the face of evil, he didn't. He took evil as a fatality, a surface. Beneath it, forces, material forces, the forces of history, the forces of being, a being that becomes, a being that is evolutionary. And this being called us to endure evil for the sake of a return to or of the gods. A return to ancient poetry, a poetic language that bespeaks the forces of evolution. This poetic language must transcend the mechanistic strictures of the 20th century, perhaps even of the 21st century. It must be a genuinely global language that encompasses all spheres of life. It doesn't try to reduce life to the mechanical mathematics of modern science. So there must be something greater than that. Modern science does not successfully, fully represent the forces of evolution. These forces manifest themselves directly, ultimately, in a kind of poetic language, a very powerful one. And Heidegger saw this powerful language already at work to some extent in Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler begins to represent these powers that underlie our existence. But Heidegger, of course, does not set out to write expositions and explanations of Hitler's discourses. He is charmed by German poets of a higher rank, Hölderlin, for example. Now, and Nietzsche himself. Now, today, many who are critical of Heidegger, and of course of Hitler, who is not, will argue that to speak of a return to poetry today is, in effect, to feed into Nazism, the way Heidegger did. This objection against any return to poetry is blind, however, to the distinction between classical poetry and what Heidegger had in mind, and also, or this is implicit in the first, to the genesis of the modern phenomenon, Heidegger himself. So it is important, for the sake of understanding things here, it is important to go back to the classics, not the way Heidegger did, to expose the inner core of classical poetry, not the way Heidegger did, in order to destroy classical poetry, in other words, but to see if the classics were ultimately right. Right in the respect that they represented in the best way the foundations of human life. For Heidegger, there was an alienation which began, progressive alienation, which began really at the beginning of civilization. An alienation that brought us to nihilism, brought us to Nietzsche, brought us to the collapse of civilization ultimately, and the need for a new beginning. So let us consider a story that begins in classical antiquity, and here we have two gentlemen who are holding books, and what are they doing? They're interpreting these books. They're perhaps even writing them. They're reading, writing, and there is a sun. The sun shines onto these books. Through these books, or through the language, there is a refracted light that is touching the writer, the reader, the interpreter. This refracted light provides insight, access to, insight into the sun itself. There is no direct vision of the sun, right? We don't have Icarus that tries to leap forward to the sun directly. We have Prudence, the prudence of Daedalus, the father. So this is what the poetic language of antiquity is all about. Language is a mirror of being, of reality, and in that respect, being is understood as fundamentally intelligible, open to understanding. We understand in being. We participate in being as fully intelligible, right? Being is not something that shifts all the time, that is obscure in and of itself, but it is welcoming of man. Being welcomes us. In other words, the foundation of our existence welcomes us, and in that respect, it deserves being called a mind, right? So, mind is the foundation of our existence. Nous in Aristotle's terms. Well, you might ask, what about the Bible? Well, the Bible is very strict about this passage from man to the foundation. Right? But once you have the Bible, you obviously have a mirror of that foundation. So you have interpretation that comes through the priests. So we have the priests, you could say you have the guides of society that help us have access to the foundation. So there is an opening to the understanding, even though there is a wall of impenetrability, one might say, when it comes to impious ascents to the divine. We have mystics, we have rabbis, we have a tradition of interpretation, right? But we do not have the philosopher alone, the cynic, the stoic, the Epicurean, who goes out of the society to tap into its ground on his own, monastically. Right? Access comes through ethics. It has an ethical dimension. All right. In comes Galileo. Well, we're speaking of Galileo here, but in fact, we're talking about the beginning of the modern world, really. But Galileo is quite indicative here. It is helpful to refer to him because he refers to nature as the book, right, of God, or the book of nature, really, which is, so we have the sun here that is in a book, right? So if we want to understand God, we have to read the book of nature, which is really God's mind. And now Galileo has found a code, secret code, modern mathematics, really, that can be, of course, deciphered and understood by everyone, demons and angels alike, certainly by the likes of Galileo. Now, if you can have access to this code, then you can study the book of nature. It's open. It's an open book to everyone. You don't need priests. You don't need rabbis. You don't need a tradition. You monastically can access that book. Through this code, you see, empowers you, right? Through this code, you can decipher nature. Now, it turns out that as you decipher nature, or the world, the universe becomes a kind of code itself. As it is codified, all aspects of nature are seen as parts of the great code. Once you establish the universe as a code, at any rate, once you conceive of it that way, you begin living in a world, you start building your own cities based on that conception, right? So, then you wind up being trapped in a world that is structured as a code mechanistically, in effect, on the basis of, modern mathematics, which is a highly symbolic, abstract language, which can be applied, right, to establish, of course, the new human order. In Hobbes' terms, in Machiavelli's terms, new modes and ways. Hobbes, founder of new political science. We're having a brave new world in, of course, to refer to the expression we find in Shakespeare. Now, once we have this world, this mechanical world, this cage of sort for some, for others, salvation, right? A secular paradise, Mecca. This is our future. Consolidate this code world where everything is codified. Everything is somehow, linguistically structured, right? Then we have, at the same time, really, we have a rejection of this, which is not a full radical rejection, but a rejection of the superstructure. The superstructure, in effect, is hiding a foundation, its own presuppositions. These presuppositions are making certain people itch. They object to the superstructure and they see some lava, something going on that has not been brought out to the surface. And this is what the Romantic period is all about, Romantic authors, and certainly Romantic poets, certainly Heidegger, certainly Nietzsche, and others. You think of Nietzscheans such as Foucault in France, various lesser league people. But at any rate, we're looking at Heidegger, and we see that we want there to break out of the cage, the superstructure, and tap into its foundation. Now, the foundation that is presupposed ontologically and logically by the structure is what early modernity calls the state of nature. That state of nature, for Heidegger, was not adequately understood by early modernity. It is not that you have the state of nature and then you build a machine world. No, he says, no, this is wrong. The state of nature somehow has to be represented on the surface. It has to break through the earlier formulations of the superstructure. So the superstructure can no longer be the old cage world, the formulas of early modernity and later modernity as well. Bureaucracy, the bureaucratic state, all of its rules and regulations, these are ultimately inadequate. They're rough versions of what is to come. What is to come is a superstructure that has to be directly, absolutely expressive of its ground. That ground that early modernity refers to as a state of nature. Devoid of divine providence and intelligence, it is brute force. Hence the rise of Nazism. Hence the passion, even the enthusiasm with which Heidegger himself accepts the rise of Hitler. He sees him as a brute sometimes, but overall he sees him as a sign of something to come, a new language that is expressive of violence. So when we speak of a return to poetry today, we can either speak with Heidegger, or we can see past Heidegger and see that there is a classical poetry, and by classical we should understand both ancient and medieval, so outside of the sphere of modernity, really. A classical language, a classical poetry that is fully compatible with a tradition of interpretation. For example, we can speak of a Platonic jurisprudence, a Platonic tradition of interpretation of authority, right? Of books, in other words, of authors, that partakes in divine intelligence, right? As an activity, divine intelligence, as an act or an activity that is at work in our own ascent to the understanding. Right? So there is an opening, an openness of man, linguistically displayed, right? This openness. There's this openness of man to the ground, and the ground that we're open to is not a violent power, but a clearing, a light that cuts through all violence, that transcends the world of becoming, really, and that ultimately calls us out of it. So we do not have, as with Heidegger, a compulsion to embrace our current state, the fallen world, our existence, as a fatality, really. We're not compelled at all to embrace the rise of a global society. Not at all. Not at all. If anything, life now becomes a question of preparing for death, preparation for death. Not preparation for collective suicide, suicide that we are setting up collectively, right? All together, working all together toward a Nazi conflagration. No. Preparation for death as given from the other side of life. So, in a Socratic way, right? Even in a Christian way, of course, insofar as the character of Christ in the Gospels greatly magnifies the role of Socrates in the Platonic dialogues. So here we have these two visions of a return to poetry. One is not a return at all. It is rather a reconstruction, as it were, of poetry, based on really a mechanistic vision of its foundation. So the idea is that the ground of human society is a vortex. And on the other side, we have, as a foundation, a providential mind, right, which calls us to it. It is welcoming us. The vortex is inseparable from our fallen condition, so there is no other world, really. in that Heideggerian vision, there is another world if the foundation of our fallen world, really, is a providential mind that welcomes us back. So now poetry becomes the mirror not of violence, but of order, an order that transcends the current facade, and that allows us to say, well, no, wait, this that you call order is really disorder. It might be an upside down situation where you call right wrong and wrong right and so forth. Everything is topsy-turvy. And there is such a thing as natural right or right in itself. And that I can say meaningfully only if there is a foundation of intelligence. Right? And if there's a foundation of intelligence, then my intelligence can have access to that ground of intelligence. And it's sustained by it. It makes sense to speak of human intelligence and human identity now that is not merely some kind of mechanical evolution, right? Or the result of a mechanical evolution from beasts, let us say, or even electromagnetic forces that come together and this develop into this facade, the superstructure of consciousness. Now, all of a sudden, I see my consciousness grounded in divine intelligence and not simply in beastly passions. Right? That we're supposed to somehow tame, somehow master and transform into a new world, right? A world that, again, is supposed to represent them while at the same time keeping them in check. Well, this is where we stand today. Now, if Heidegger is right, as far as his recognizing that the modern superstructure has failed, then our current situation is untenable. In the modern world, we got rid of poetry. Everything is a code. Everything is, we live in a machine world. We're scared of what's out of the machine because somehow, it's violent out there. Well, Heidegger says, of course, that, we have to get to that violence and let it express itself on the surface, and that'll settle the matter. No, it won't. That'll bring about, of course, collective suicide, more violence. So, but if we are scared of that result, that this fear should not distract us from the fundamental alternative given by our classics. That alternative, once again, involves a recognition of a destiny, a human destiny, that transcends our fallen world. We're not trying to establish a Tower of Babel. We're not trying to represent the absolute here and now in a final way. We are pointing back to a divine intelligence that necessarily at this point calls us to moderation. We maintain a tradition of interpretation that constitutes really the poetic world. This poetic world is not a kind of legalistic structure where everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. It is not clear and distinct as Descartes demands that it be, that our world become. The world of tradition is a world that is focused on prudence. Prudence, moderation, maintaining windows, doors open to fundamental questions. Carefully, in dialogue, without trying to settle problems once and for all, but trying to open our lives to fundamental problems understood as their own solutions. What appears to us, what in fact is for us in our fallen world, a curse, all of our problems, our daily problems, in the other world, is a solution. The fundamental problems that are in the mind are spheres of understanding, of intelligibility. They are forms of understanding. We breathe through them. But in our fallen world, they're curses. I broke my leg. This happened. There was a storm. But all of these obstacles, we perceive as obstacles in this world, horrible things, atrocious things. I just gave 2 minor examples. There's all kinds of horrible business that we have to deal with in our fallen world. This is somehow converted in the mind. As long as these phenomena, these problems are outside of the mind, they're curses. But when they're in the mind, but in whose mind? Not mine as a Cartesian ego. So the classics ultimately agree. Well, it's good. All of these ideas or these forms of intelligibility are in God's mind. And that is what the Middle Ages overall agree upon. Right? Middle Ages, medieval writers, canonical writers, they all agree that all of our problems ultimately are in God. And in God, they are blessings. This does not, of course, tell us that all of our troubles here, they're no big deal. They are a big deal for us as long as we're in a fallen world. But they're not the end of the story. And this should tranquilize us a bit. It certainly should tell us that, it does tell us that we should not be overtaken by what is shocking, what is new. Right? Because ultimately, what counts is what is always